Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society's Historical Group. And my name is Michael Pritchard. I'm edit the photo historian. And it's a pleasure this evening to hand over to Gilly Reid, the group's chair, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Gilly, over to you.
Hello, I'm Gilly. And tonight we are welcoming Tony Richards, who is the senior photographer and lead in advanced photographic techniques at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library, which is part of the University of Manchester. And he is going to talk to us about his practice using historic techniques, but tonight specifically wet-collodion. So as I'm interested in that period in Manchester's photography, I think that's going to be fascinating for me. The wet-collodion process, of course, was invented by Frederick Scott Archer. He didn't patent it in England, and so it could be used by anybody. And so it really opened the floodgates for photography, and things developed very rapidly after that, because before then in England, the daguerreotype and also Fox Talbot's invention were all patented. So anyway, I will hand you over now to Tony to explain how it all works.
Best way to start. There we go. Okay, can you confirm you can see that?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great, Tony. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As Gilly said, I'm Tony Richards, and I'm one of a growing number of wet plate collodion photographers. Over the past 14 years, wet plate has become my main method of image making. So I thought maybe a bit of a backstory to you first. 24 years ago, I did a photography degree as a mature student. I really didn't pay much attention to analog processes, as digital was the new thing and it was all the rage. So when I left university, I was quite I didn't quite enjoy photography, let's say, even though I was working digitally with photography. And it wasn't until about 2010 when I saw a YouTube video of a US wet plater called Luther Gerlach shooting amazing images out of the back of his van that I really began to take interest in forms of historic photography. So I did a search for UK wet platers and I found John Brewer, luckily in the Manchester area. And I asked him if he would give workshops, as he'd recently learnt wet plate. He would, and that was the start, really. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride since then. Some people describe wet plate collodion as magic or alchemy, and I can understand that. But to me, it's still just basic photography, but in one of its most frustrating forms. Gilly's already mentioned that. So this is Frederick Scott Archer, an English photographer and sculptor, and he's responsible for inventing the wet plate collodion process. And as Gilly said, he didn't patent his discovery. Some say it's because he offered it as a gift to the world, and others because he couldn't afford the patent fees. So sadly, he died in poverty. I'll try to keep a description of the process quite brief, although for those of you in the UK, you can watch BBC 4's Britain in Focus, a photographic history, which aired again last night. This featured short demonstrations of the calotype and wet plate processes, also including John Brewer. So what is wet plate collodion photography? So looking at this slide on your screen at the moment, a glass or metal plate is cut and cleaned. It's then coated by flowing a syrupy solution called collodion over the cleaned plate. Before that collodion dries, it's immersed into a light, tight tank of silver nitrate. This then becomes light sensitive or photosensitive. After a few minutes, it's removed, placed in the camera's plate holder. It's exposed in the camera, returned to the darkroom, and it's developed in hand and then fixed. This results in a collodion positive or a negative. These first steps must be carried out whilst the plate is still wet, otherwise it just loses its photosensitivity. The collodion layer is very fragile, and once it's dry, it must be protected with a layer of varnish. So we have collodion positives such as ambrotypes, which are collodion positives on glass, and we have tintypes and ferrotypes, which are collodion images on metal plates. An easier way of showing you this is showing you this glass plate. So I've included this image. It's a very good way of showing the negative and positive aspects of a collodion glass plate. So an ambrotype is basically an underexposed collodion negative. And when something dark is placed behind it, it can be viewed as a positive. Now, this could be paint, fabric, black varnish, or sometimes I use exposed and fixed photo paper. Much the same could be seen for those of you that shoot film with underexposed film negatives when viewed under certain lighting conditions. So wet plate is sometimes portrayed as being dangerous and explosive. I couldn't find much documented evidence of that being the case doing a quick search online. But as Gilly's mentioned, I work at the John Rylands Library. There's plenty of material to look through. So today I was just happened to be going through the shelving and I picked off a Victorian periodical album just out of curiosity to see if there was anything photography related. And just by chance, I found this, which I suppose relates to the dangers of wet plate collodion in a way. And this is from a lady who's passed out and died from heat exhaustion. Whether this is a true story or not, I don't know. But this is from the day's doings from August 19th, 1871. So let's just say most things can be hazardous. When it comes to chemistry, common sense, proper handling, storage, and respect are needed. Don't go throwing it around. Keep it away from food and drink, and with some, keep well away from naked flames. Always read the safety data sheets. They are available online with most chemical supply companies, and follow any health and safety procedures set in place where you're working. So enough said, that's my official bit done, I suppose. So, okay, chemistry. Let's start with silver nitrate. This is what makes your plate photosensitive. You can see it here on the top left as these little white crystals. You can get about 100 grams for about 80 to 100 pounds at the moment. And you'll need 90 grams of silver nitrate in a litre of deionized water to make up a fresh 9% solution, which is probably enough to fill a 10 by 8 tank. So the tanks are on your right of the screen. You've got one made out of black perspex and one which is made out of glass, which goes into a wooden tank. When the lid is closed, they're light tight. Silver nitrate is corrosive. It can stain your fingers quite easily. Gloves are recommended along with other protective clothing and safety goggles. You choose what you use, but you can see how easily my fingers have stained in this picture, and that's just by handling the above silver nitrate for that picture. And I didn't even realize that had happened. Collodion. So you hear us talking about collodion. Collodion is nitrocellulose dissolved in alcohol and ether. Then it's mixed with a variety of salts like cadmium and potassium bromide and iodides. Be aware that some of these chemicals, especially cadmium bromide, are carcinogenic, and proper respiratory protection is needed when mixing. Again, read the safety data sheets. It's on the left of the screen, you can see it's a light straw color when it's fresh, and as it ages, it darkens to a deep red color. On the right of the screen is all my waste collodion, I suppose. So collodion, when it's sensitized, it's got an ISO of 1 or less. So it's a very slow photographic emulsion, and it gets slower as it ages. Fresh collodion can be flat in contrast compared to older collodion, and some users might mix old and new to get a happy medium. Wet plate collodion is orthochromatic, so you can sensitize the plate and handle it in a safe light, darkroom condition. But it doesn't record all colors equally. Blues tend to be lighter, reds tend to be darker, and that's always worth bearing in mind when shooting certain subjects. If you don't mix your own collodion or don't want to mix your own collodion, there are numerous pre-mixed recipes with weird names like Old Workhorse, Old Reliable, Lee Landscape, Poor Boy, New Guy. There's all sorts. And a small bottle will cost you about 20 to 25 pounds. That's if you can find a supplier. There used to be a really good UK supplier called Wet Plate Supplies. They sadly no longer exist. So there are now 2 UK individuals who provide pre-mixed collodion. That's John Brewer in Manchester and Gareth Jarvis, who's in Penarth, South Wales. You can, like I say, you can try to mix your own, but recipes also include diethyl ether, and that's quite difficult to obtain. It's also got quite a low flash point, and it'd be dangerous to store in larger amounts than you actually need. I'd recommend either John or Gareth. There are others mixing occasionally in the UK, but you need to know who they are and ask nicely, I suppose. The developer is very simple to make. You can't use regular film or paper developer, unfortunately. Remember, the plate is developed in hand by observation. First, the highlights appear, followed by the midtones, and then the plate is stopped with a jug of water just as the shadow details appear. It's still developing as you're pouring the stop water. So timing and observation is crucial, and overexposure and overdevelopment are common errors early on. Development in hand usually takes about 15 to 20 seconds. The main ingredients, as you can see on screen here, are iron sulfate, acetic acid, IDA or industrial denatured alcohol, and deionized water. I say deionized water because it's much cheaper than distilled water in the UK. Other additives that you can see on screen there, we've got, well, it's not on the screen, sugar, saltpeter or potassium nitrate, and copper sulfate. Some people like to add these to enhance their plate and act as a restrainer. The IDA, which you can see in that big bottle, industrial denatured alcohol, that's the only thing you really need a license for from Your Majesty's Revenues and Customs. So you need a license for purchasing and the use of IDA, although some people do like to substitute it for other types of alcohol. When it comes to fixer, any type of fixer you can use: Ilford, Rapid, Hypam, ammonia thiosulfate, and some people still use potassium cyanide as a fixer. The fixed plates are then washed in running water and put to one side to dry. So the processed plate requires protection when it's dry, as it's easily scratched and it tarnishes over time. And varnishing, I suppose, can be the most daunting stage for many a wet plater, as some varnishes, when of a certain age or ripeness, can melt the image on the plate. There's nothing worse than shooting a fantastic image, pouring the varnish on, tilting it to pour the varnish off, and it dissolves and slides off your plate. Totally ruins your day. On the screen, you can see a number of different varnishes and finishes. We've got traditional gum sandrack and shellac, are the historic varnishes, and I use both of those. We've got Liquitex and a white acrylic that dries to a clear gloss and takes forever, but it takes forever to dry unless it's heated. There's a tin of Winsor Newton aerosol art varnish, which I know some people like to use, but then how many coats do you apply, and the risk of an orange peel finish. And right at the front, you've got something called Renaissance Wax, which is a conservation-friendly microcrystalline wax polish. But there are questions on how protective it is in the long term. It's very much a case of trying them, and each to your own. You'll find one that you prefer to use, but I always recommend sandrack and shellac, but they all have their own pros and cons. So we mentioned amber types and tin types. One's on glass, one's on metal. Those are the different substrates that we use. I use 2mm picture glass. I buy it in packs of 10 to 25, depending on the size. I then cut it down with a glass cutter to the size I need, depending on the camera I'm using. We have trophy aluminium. That's on the left of the screen, I suppose. That's what most people use for what we call tin types, but it's aluminium. I don't know anyone in the UK that Japans their own metal plates. I buy large 2-foot by 5-foot sheets, and I cut it down with a sharp blade and a guillotine to the sizes I need. The good thing about trophy aluminium plates is they come with a protective layer that you just peel off and you're good to go. You just flow the collodion. There's no cleaning involved. You might need a blower brush to blow off any dust from static, but it's a lot less hassle than using glass. But I do believe there's a different look between using clear glass than there is to metal plates, a different type of depth. Of course, these can be bought pre-cut to size, but I shoot a variety of sizes, so I prefer to cut my own, plus it works out a lot cheaper. There's also people that use perspex and acrylic and other materials, and in many different colors. There's examples of wet platers shooting on vinyl records, dog tags, the inside of 35mm cassettes, and also black glass is lovely to shoot on. But finding smooth black glass is getting more and more difficult and very expensive. Cameras and lenses. Now, this is where it can start getting very silly. I'm not the only wet plater that gets carried away with buying wooden cameras and brass lenses. Don't get me wrong, they look amazing, they are beautiful things, but they can be really difficult to use if not in perfect working order. Any camera you can get a plate into and has some sort of bulb, timed or open shutter setting can be used for wet plate. You don't need to spend a lot of money. You don't need these big fancy mahogany cameras. You can use a box brownie, 35mm SLR, your plastic Holga camera. You can even use your prize Hasselblad with a spare film holder just for wet plate if you like. On the screen you can see a few of my studio cameras. Yes, I get addicted to collecting them. And on the right is my Hunter Penrose process camera, which took 16.5 by 20-inch plates. And I'm not sure who that chap is standing at the end, the slim fella with less grey hair. So people ask, where do you find all these lovely cameras? And I must say, it's just luck and good timing. Here's an original sliding box camera I found on Gumtree. A fellow wet plater collected it and sent it to me with the usual, "you lucky so-and-so" comments. It was in a bit of a state. There was no plate holder and it had a dirty brass lens. A day or two later, the seller found the plate holder and sent it to me free of charge. The brass lens, after a quick rub back, turned out to be by Andrew Ross, a well-known lens manufacturer. He died in 1859, so we could date this camera before that and put it firmly in the wet plate era, very early wet plate era. I had to, in the bottom right side of the screen, you can see I had to put my trust in the hands of a talented woodworker and camera maker, Mark Vos, who did me a huge favour and repaired the rear of the camera. Seeing it go through a rotary table saw was something I don't really want to repeat. I had to close my eyes. Now, normally I would never suggest you buy an old wooden camera without its plate holder. Please buy it with plate holders. They all seem to be different sizes and different fits, but this was a rare example where I took a gamble. And if you're going to buy old cameras, then make sure things like you've got the appropriate tripods that work with them. Here's my 12 by 15-inch field camera. That would have had 3 loose single legs mounted onto a brass ring on the bottom of the camera. That was missing. So I came up with this idea of a camera table which prevents movement in all directions. You just need, again, to know someone who's a very handy woodworker like Mark Vos. And as you can see, I do like a bargain, and that's part of the thrill of sourcing these big brass lenses, much sought after by many a wet plate photographer. From the holy grail brass lenses like the Dalmayer 4B, seen here on the left, held for ransom here by fellow wet plater and friend Patrick Ballinger. Again, I got that off Gumtree for a ridiculously cheap amount of money. And on the right is a lovely soft focus lens mounted as a curiosity paperweight that I found at a local antique fair. It's in perfect working order and shoots lovely plates. Again, it was cheap. So when I speak to sellers and they say, "Oh, I kept this one because I like the look of it and I threw the others out," my heart really sinks. And of course, the general rule is a small camera, small plates, and a big camera, big plates. So I've got a small 35mm plate tin type there, just put in an old 35mm camera, and on the right a 12 by 15-inch plate, but that's as large as I go nowadays. As I said, it can get a bit silly, and every now and again you have to move one on. Here's me saying my last goodbyes to the Hunter Penrose camera, all packaged up with its plate holder and a huge sensitizing tank. It was unceremoniously dumped into the back of a large transit van, And within 24 hours, it was with its new owner. This is Maris, and he's in Riga, Latvia. So that's where that went. And I always regret selling that camera. It was lovely. So how does one get into wet plate photography? I would seriously recommend a workshop of some sort. I'll take a wild guess, and it is a generalization, that many of today's wet platers have been taught by, or they were taught by someone who was taught by one of the three big names in the wet plate community. Now that would be Mark and Francis Osterman, John Coffer, and Quinn Jacobson, all based in the US. They've all published their own wet plate instruction manuals, well worth a look if you're thinking about getting into wet plate. There are also many others responsible for the resurgence of modern wet plate photography. Many fly under the radar. I must mention Sam McKenna in the UK, who started to shoot wet plate collodion way back in 2000, having to make his own chemistry, including collodion from gun cotton. Sadly, Sam passed away in 2012. So I would always recommend a workshop and a good book for learning wet plate collodion. Yes, there are some that have taught themselves, but save yourself a lot of time, money, and hassle by finding an established wet plate photographer to show you the process, and more importantly, how to problem solve any issues that you might have. I, of course, provide tuition. I'd be daft not to mention that. Here's Beth in my new studio. Beth had already done a wet plate workshop with another provider, but came to me for a refresher course. I really enjoy seeing the smiles on someone's face when they're starting off in wet plate. That enthusiasm is infectious. Here you can see Beth applying Renaissance wax that we mentioned earlier, and also flowing shellac varnish prior to drying on the hot plate. I try to provide as many options as possible to give people the feel of what's available and how they can be used. This is Christelle, who flew over from Paris a while back in my old studio for a somewhat unconventional workshop. She had no interest at all in using the lovely wooden cameras and brass lenses. She wanted to be able to make plates from her digital images by contact printing. So we experimented with a range of clear acetates, inkjet printed her digital images and laid them onto the sensitized plate and exposed to white light from the darkroom enlarger. Here you can see on the bottom left, you can see some unwanted swirly clouds from one type of acetate. And then by switching to a different brand, on the other side, you can see some lovely close-up details of her finished plates. Now, I know there will be some purists out there moaning that this isn't true wet plate photography. Yes, I know. I'm not going to get into that here, but I have no issues at all with people blurring the boundaries of digital and analog processes, as Christelle is doing here. Okay, darkrooms and studios. I've been lucky enough to have 3 different studios and darkrooms and old cotton mills in the northwest of England. The main reason for seeking a studio space is that silver nitrate stains, and stains over the kitchen work surfaces at home aren't a good thing, apparently. So here's my first studio, which I shared with John Brewer. I asked if he'd be interested in sharing a space in Ancoats in Manchester, and this is at Wellington House, or Wellington Mill. We took on 1,000 square feet with these lovely big mill windows, and we shared that space for about 3 years. I moved to a smaller unit downstairs, which is about 400 square foot. It was, again, in a right state. And I think the owners of the mill rely on the tenants to slowly renovate the mill for them at their own expense, which is quite clever, really. I was then surprised to find I'd been in this studio for about 10 years when the contract came to an end. That was in 2023. And the rent was hiked by 150%, making it unaffordable for my needs. I was then very lucky to find this space, and this is on the 4th floor of Lee Spinner's Mill. I'm also lucky to be surrounded by a number of creatives and artists, and it's a very positive community feel. Plus, it's only 15 minutes from my house. Again, it's a lot of work to get it up and running, but I think I'm nearly there. You can see over my shoulders probably that it's nearly finished, as finished as it could be, but I could see the potential in these 2 images when I first visited. There was a lot of work to do, as I said, stripping, repairing, sealing floors, plastering and painting, building a new darkroom and store. That's thanks to the youngsters involved with Elysium training, who built my darkroom with supervision from their teachers. Thank you. But what if a large studio and a darkroom is not always possible for most people. What are the alternatives to this or the home darkroom? What do you do when you go mobile and want to shoot on location? Some opt for a vehicle. Here's on the left, my hydroponic tent in the back of my old Peugeot. This also doubles as storage when traveling, and I could shoot up to 12 by 15-inch plates at the back of the car. In the middle, we've got Tony Lavelle, an excellent photographer, not just in wet plates. He has a trailer which he tows with all the mod cons inside, heating, running water, you name it, he's got it. And lastly, my old van with an MDF box and a blackout blind, I think it was. So if it works, and that's good enough. Some people get a little bit more creative. On the left, we've got an adapted pram and a flight case. Then we've got Gerald Figal from the US with his portable dark box with a lid off. You just pop your arms through the holes, look through a red rubylith window, and see what you're doing. So here he's coating some microscope slides, I think it was, for shooting in a 35mm camera. Then we have the late Simon Harbord, who was a great experimental photographer and wet plater. And this is his garden potting station darkroom and some tent poles. So you can basically make it out of whatever you like. And then finally is my old adapted wooden suitcase. You can shoot up to 5 by 7-inch plates in there. And I loan that out on occasion when people are stuck with what to use. So you can use almost anything you like as long as it's light tight and you have enough room to maneuver inside. So what do you do with all your plates once you've shot them? Well, one issue you might come to is you might want to frame them and display them on a wall if you've got enough wall space. You can use the traditional 4-fold acid-free paper holders and store them standing vertically, or maybe use storage boxes like I've shown here on the left, which is how I keep my larger plates. And some people are surprised, especially considering I work in the field of heritage imaging and preservation, when I say I edit my plates with a hammer once a year. And I find that quite therapeutic, as you can see on the right. It's probably a good time to mention something that's needed for all wet plate photography, and that's light, lots of light. Remember, it's ISO 1 or less. A growing number of wet platers are using flash photography, shooting at many thousands of watts per second, and sometimes with a flash edge really close to the sitter. I can imagine the singed eyebrows. You get pin sharp plates, yes, but buying and maintaining these high-powered packs and heads can be very costly. Daylight is, of course, free, but it's time limited and not guaranteed, especially in the northwest of England. The huge windows of my new studio, as you can see on the screen here, were a major attraction for me taking on this place. I also make use of a couple of constant fluorescent bulb kits. They are daylight balanced. They allow for about 10-second exposure to f4 for comfortable distance from the sitter for portraits. And I'm content with that. Daylight and my constant fluorescent bulbs is fine for me. And I like the idea that the plate is several seconds of someone's life captured in silver. I like that. And, well, let's see if this works. It's working, yeah. And if you're brave or daft enough, there's always good old flash powder. Although it seems a little foolish now, one thing I did learn during this moment was that this was shot outdoors at night time and you didn't need a darkroom. So the plate was poured, loaded, sensitized, processed, all in open air, no fogging, and that still amazes me. So how can you find out more about wet plate collodion? A good way to find out about wet plate is to attend a demonstration or event. This is me at my workplace a few years ago, the John Rylands Library, inviting the visitors to sit for plates. It was basically pull your name out of a bowler hat and have your plate taken. They were supplied with high-res digital copies as the actual plates went into the special collections themselves at the library. I wonder if I can get this to work. There we go. See if this works. Get the laser pointer. On the left here, you can see the Watson Studio camera. And these are those compact fluorescent lights that or continuous lighting that I was talking about. And you've got exposures for about 10-15 seconds at that distance. And on the right, you can see that portable dark box that I made out of a wooden suitcase. And it's ideal just to sit down at and process some plates. For me, one of the formative things that happened to me was attending the wet plate jamboree at Camp Tintype. Very on in early 2012, I managed to secure some arts funding that allowed me to travel to Upper New York State to visit John Coffer at Camp Tintype, where he holds this jamboree every year. It's a fantastic opportunity. I had taken my own camera, but John lent me a tripod and some chemistry so I could shoot some plates whilst I was there. And it's at events like this that you really pick up those little tips and tricks that help you along your way. It's also an amazing opportunity to see some very talented wet plate photographers and artists. Just going to point out this image here. And that scene is captured here. And that's actually on purple aluminium. So it's actually a purple tintype, let's say. That blew my mind. I didn't even think of that. Some of the plates I shot. And it's really here that I began to understand the needs of the process, especially shooting with daylight. And I was quite pleased with these, even with a lot of the mess and the errors that are on them. So what do you do now that you've learned and gathered these skills? Well, practice is the answer. And my preference and what I enjoy the most is shooting on location and showing people the process. Prior to COVID, a small number of us would attend the Phoenix Alternative Festival in mid-Wales, billed as a steampunk subculture alternative boutique festival. We'd be invited along to set up a wet plate studio, and the monies raised from our portraits would go to local charities. Now, we've been to a number of times, and the steampunk community make for great subjects for wet plate, as in Martin, as you can see in the center of the screen. Amazing plate, love it. What's also good about just not shooting the plates, you get to explain the process and other historic methods, shoot as many places as possible, raise loads of money, and have a great time, as you can see on screen. We also bought this huge, tent here, which we bought off eBay for a ridiculously cheap amount. And Andy Billington, on Moopa, as he's called, tows that around on a trailer on the back of his extra long camper van. Takes a few hours to take up, but less time to take it down. Of course, it doesn't always go smoothly. As you can see on the left, I'm using an oil burner to varnish my plates. I don't always do that. This is mostly for the theatre of it, for an event. And most of the time it's perfectly fine. In this instance, the plate is heated for just a little too long, or the flame has crept around the side of the plate and whoosh, it's gone up in flames. Now, if you catch that in time, you can blow the flame out and save the plate. In this example, I must admit I panicked. I instinctively threw it to the ground and stamped the flames out. Big mistake. The emulsion was scratched and it left a giant footprint. Needless to say, I rarely use a naked flame for varnishing anymore. Later on, I was invited in 2019 to the British School of Rome, that's in Italy, of course, to provide a wet plate collodion demonstration to the Ashby patrons, the fellows, and the staff. Of course, flying with wet plate chemistry is prohibited, so I ordered all the chemistry pre-mixed online and had it shipped to the British School of Rome well in advance. Everything else, excluding the kitchen sink, was packed into a very large suitcase. Unfortunately, it weighed over 30 kilos, so a little creative repacking was needed. I tried to pack for every eventuality, but there's a limit to what one person can carry. The staff at the British School of Rome, they had adapted the cloakrooms into an excellent temporary darkroom, very near to running water and drainage, probably the cleanest darkroom I've ever worked in, and I was paranoid that I'd make a mess. As every wet plate photographer can appreciate, arriving at a shoot with unproven, untested chemistry is a challenge some might not want to accept. I fought with the chemistry every step of the way. Fogging on all plates was an issue. Problem solving takes time. Every test plate I made, I was conscious I was using up chemistry that I needed for the next day's shoot. The Thursday I was meant to be making a public demonstration for the fellows and the staff. And it's a little embarrassing showing a process when it's not working at its best. Luckily on the day, the stars aligned and I produced a plate everyone, including myself, was happy with. Of course, there's a little chemistry left. I couldn't take it home with me, so we had an impromptu wet plate workshop. And this is some of the staff and fellows having a go at pouring plates and shooting plates for themselves. They'd obviously listened quite attentively as they picked it up very quickly. And what a lovely place to be shooting plates. And some of the plates that they shot, a quarter plate and a whole plate tin type. So I've been very lucky with the opportunities that have come my way with wet plate collodion. For a while, we had a number of Victorian TV programs on in the UK. I'm just going to skip through them quickly because I'm not no idea how much time we're under. Victorian Bakers in 2015, BBC Two, filmed at the Black County Living Museum near Dudley. You couldn't tell on screen, but although it's a summer's day, it was very wet and stormy. I've not had much luck with weather. I'd been asked for measurements beforehand by the costume department, and apparently a Victorian gentleman measures his waist somewhat differently to a jeans wearing bloke like me. This resulted in a very tight pair of trousers that ripped right across the gusset towards the end of filming. Not my greatest moment, thankfully not seen on TV, but the plate was a success and everyone enjoyed it. Then there was Time Crashers, again also in 2015, filmed on the Sussex coast. I had to be on set something ridiculous like 5 o'clock in the morning because they didn't want any vehicle noise spoiling this filming. My portable darkroom was back in the car and I parked it out of view of the cameras, just close enough to where they were shooting. Then I went and had a cup of tea and a bacon sarnie and the heavens opened. I wasn't due to shoot till 11 a.m. It ended up being 2 or 3 p.m. by the time I shot these plates, and everyone was soaking wet and freezing cold. A crew member even got taken to hospital by ambulance due to hypothermia. Not a good start. And where I had parked my car, my darkroom, now had a river running beneath it. So I was given a plank of wood to stand on and balance whilst I poured my plate while stood at the darkroom. There was no script, and cameras were constantly filming from all directions. So I was told, go down the banking, do your thing, come back out, and that sounded easy enough. So I walked down the banking, I go to set up, and as soon as I place the camera, one of the tripod legs falls off, and all I can hear is Keith Allen saying, "So they sent a blooming professional then." I really didn't know what to do with myself. The camera under my arm, tight pair of trousers again, and a tripod leg in the floor. The risk of splitting my trousers again was a very, very real. Looking back on it now, it was very funny, but at the time I was gutted. You try to be as professional as you can. And a little later in the day, Keith Allen approached me and said he was surprised that you were actually taking a photograph. I thought you were pretending. I thought you were just hired in to look like you were doing something. And he was surprised at the end of the day, and I had to contact print Van Dyke Brown prints for each of the cast. So I think it was a dozen in total prints at the end of the day, just made with a UV bank and a contact printer. And that's what you can see on screen there. I don't think I'll offer the printing again. It's far too much hard work. The Victorian Slum on BBC Two, April 2016. The production team had asked if I could produce images in the style of Horace Warner. So he was responsible for the Spitalfield Nippers body of work. I had experienced that was probably dry plate that had been produced with. But I could shoot in the style of, but wet plate collodion is a different process altogether. That really wasn't an issue for the production team, and they were really interested in the final images rather than the process that I was using. Some images on screen here. I was very pleased with how these turned out, and the plates were given out to the cast at the end of the day. I just wish I had decent digital copies, because that's one thing is you shoot all these plates, you tend to give them away or they get sold to somebody, and you don't have a copy for yourself. This is what I've got. So most of these images are just screen grabs and downloads from blogs and social media. This was the BBC drama The Paradise Series 2, which features a wet plate photographer. And I was hired as a consultant and prop supplier of cameras and equipment. And this was filmed in the northeast of England, the Lambton estate, over 6 days, over 2 weeks. And again, embarrassing myself, as I tend to do, in the opening scene, as you can see in this strip on the left, they empty the set of the crew and they just have the director and the cast to run through the lines. And I was asked to stay behind to make sure the actors interacted with the camera correctly. And I sat myself down in the window seat behind everyone. And at which point, Ben Daniels, who's on the top left there, he looked directly at me and he said, "So this collodion apparatus, is it an improvement on the daguerreotype?" To which I replied, "That's a very good question." And the director promptly turned around and shouted, "Shut up!" It's only then that I realized that they were running through the script, and I just reacted as naturally as to the question. So although I hadn't been contracted to shoot wet plates on this job, I did take along some spare chemistry just in case the opportunity rose. So that is just a set shot on the bottom right, a little tintype. I think it was 5 by 7 inch. But I was also asked if it would be possible to shoot the scripted portraits throughout the series, and that was probably ended up about 24 portraits. And those were quite challenging because the lighting wasn't appropriate. Also on this screen, you can see on the top right, it's actually a faked plate. And can you see it's actually a positive rather than a negative? The art department had made several different stages of plate, giving the illusion of development and fixing without appreciating the process or discussing it with me. These scenes were cut. A shame considering how much the art department put into it. And here's a small wet plate world, I suppose. Here are some of Betsy Reed's paperwork from Laycock Abbey. She had recently been artist in residence there, visiting from the US. And the woodworkers on the set had used her paperwork to help design the dark box or the dark room. And they'd hinged the sides so that the TV cameras could film inside. And it's fascinating to watch. And of course, in the final edit, as they do in most of these TV shows, they'd added the sound of a shutter after each photograph is shown on screen. So of course, the camera has no shutter, just a lens cap. And my fellow wet platers were delighted in pointing it out to me that they could hear a every time they showed an image. Let's not forget Great British Railway Journeys with Michael Patillo, also featuring the RPS's very own Michael Pritchard. An episode about pioneer photographer John Dilwyn Llewellyn. We were supposed to be shooting in the library rooms of Swansea Museum, but the light was awful. They also had UV films on the glass of the window, so it was not appropriate at all. But luckily and thankfully, the director asked if it was possible to travel to Penllygare Estate and shoot a portrait on location at the waterfalls, similar in style to one of the unpublished images in Llewellyn's albums, which is what you can see on screen here. Light was failing and it was getting late, but I think we managed to get a decent shot. And I think that was about 15 seconds, I think it was, and he did pretty well standing still. I've also been lucky enough to move on to 2 movies. The Limehouse Golem, directed by Juan Carlos Medina, featuring Bill Nighy, Olivia Cook and Douglas Booth. And here you can see my portable darkroom and camera set up in various locations on different sets, always never too far away from the filming. There were a large number of cast photographs to take, including Karl Marx here, which came out not too bad. A series of nude plates that were also used in abundance in one scene of the movie. And plenty of very disturbing dead bodies, appendages, and scenes of crimes photographs. Of course, the red blood doesn't show very well in wet plate, being orthochromatic. So that was a huge challenge and trying to explain that to the art department as we were going. And if cables aren't enough of a trip hazard with extension leads, fake blood is definitely very slippery and added health and safety risk. That was an incredible job to work on over several months all over the UK. But it was not always plain sailing. I've added this plate as a reminder to myself that when working under extreme stress, mistakes do happen. In one scene, I was shooting in very cramped conditions. Lighting's incorrect. The actress had been laying on the floor with fake intestines hanging out for a couple of hours. And the plates didn't come out due to the lights not being correct. The director was in my face shouting, "You're supposed to know what you're doing. Get off my set." It was hot, I was stressed, I was embarrassed, and I was sent away to where I'd set out. Out of confusion, I poured another plate and shot this, just where the camera stood pointing out the window. I had no idea what was going on. I was so annoyed. Do you know what I'd done? I put the plate holder into the camera backwards, and I hadn't even exposed the plate. So now I write back all the time on my plate holders. Just going to skip that one because I'm very aware of time going on. Just going to mention briefly the European Collodion Weekend, which is held in Eindhoven and Luxembourg since 2012. Here you get to see so many amazing wet platers working with wet plate collodion. On the left, you've got wet plate suppliers who provide free samples for you to try and show you all the different results you can get with the different varieties of chemistry. You can see the quick fish tents at the top there, which also uses dark rooms, and they're not always light tight. So that one you can see a white plate with a finger on it. That's me holding up a plate to the darkroom window to see if it's fogging our place, and it was. So that's an unexposed plate which is fogged and my fingers in the way. And sometimes on the right you can get really frustrated with yourself. This is Vanetta from Bulgaria. She had the most piercing blue eyes, and I just couldn't get it right. And I just ran my fingernail through the emulsion in front of everyone, and there was a big gasp. "What are you doing?" But if you've only got so many plates to shoot with, this is black glass. You can clean it off and shoot it again and again, which is what I was doing. Here's some more successful plates at the time. And again, that thing of you give the plates away, you don't keep them for yourself. So these are only quick mobile phone shots, usually in the tray of water or on a drying rack. And I try to remind myself each time I must take a portable copy stand. The illustrated collodion news was something that Andrew Billington and myself came up with, especially during COVID. This is a newspaper raising money for Mind, the mental health charity. We've got an Etsy page for our merch, mugs and t-shirts. And this is the t-shirt's actually an illustration by Mark Osterman with the prehistoric processes. One thing we must mention is the UK Wet Plate Weekend. It's been going since 2013, sometimes being held twice a year. We've visited the Scottish borders, the Peak District. This is Lantony Priory in Wales, and this is Jeong Lee from Seoul in South Korea, who borrowed some kit to shoot these lovely whole plate ambrotypes. It's actually also amazing because it's got a bar in the crypt. We've been to Laycock Abbey a few times, the birthplace of British photography. And here you can see some 12 by 15 inch plates and some prints I've made on location. The last 3 years, though, the UK event has been held at Guy's Cliff in Warwick, kindly organised by Ray Spence, who some of you know at the RPS. Again, here are some of my plates and prints that I make in the fields as I'm shooting. I'm not a fan of the cyanotype, as some of you will know, so I often tone them with tea and coffee. So this would have been coffee from that morning's breakfast, toning to get rid of the blue into a lovely warm brown. You are more than welcome to come along to this year's event. Probably the Saturday the 17th would be the best day to turn up. Please come along, see what's going on, and have a chat. So what's next? With growing numbers of wet plate photographers amongst those interested in historical processes, there also comes an interest in providing for them. Small businesses are now providing photographic equipment and cameras using the latest 3D printing methods. There are also some, like Mark Vos near Leeds, who will provide handmade wooden cameras, which are lovely. Photographic companies and individuals are now making chemistry more readily available to the wet plate community, such as Gareth Jarvis, John Brewer, plus some of the larger companies are providing the basic chemistry. I suppose I see wet plate as a gateway drug to all the other photographic processes. We've seen that those that start down this journey soon seek new methods of, whether it's negative contact printing or many other processes like cyanotype, albumin, salt, or even going further and looking at producing calotypes and daguerreotypes. For me, I need to settle into this new studio, shoot more plates, especially with the light improving each week, and find time to concentrate on bromide and photopolymer printing for my wet plate images, something I've been dabbling with over the past so many years. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble on. It's been great to revisit my blog and reflect on what I've done over the past 14 years, the places I've been, and the amazing people I've met. If anyone's interested in a workshop or would like to know a bit more, please do get in touch, or maybe I can put you in touch with someone who lives closer to you. Thank you. And here's some links of the things I've mentioned throughout my talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. That was fabulous, and what an wonderful career in collodion that you've had. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, and if anybody else has any questions, please drop them on the chat, and we'll relay those back to Tony. So the first question that's come in is asking about the environmental impact and the chemistry, and whether you've got any advice for that, particularly in these particular times of being green.
Yeah, it is an issue with wet plate, definitely. Although it's trace amounts of chemicals, as with all silver photography, there will be issues. I don't think I shoot enough wet plate to actually warrant saving the fixer or anything like that to recycle the silver. I am aware of it. I can't think of anything that would help apart from stopping shooting wet plate.
Okay.
Sorry.
And the next question I've got here is asking whether you go back to the early manuals from the 1850s and 60s and look at the chemistry that they were using, or the different processes for collodion, and whether you experiment with that in your own practice.
Yeah, it's a good question. When I first started, yes, but again, you're reinventing the wheel. It's good to know what was found and how they did it. But a lot of the measurements in the early books are in peculiar measurements like drachms and drops and drips, and and translating that into UK measurements can be a bit problematic. So I just go with, or I would suggest just going with the modern interpretations and manuals that are out there. Yeah, feel free and go through all the old books and work it out for yourself if you want. Depends on how much time you've got on your hands.
And what we've got here. Oh yeah, it's a sort of more general question, actually, perhaps more philosophical, about why you think there's this resurgence of interest in analog, but specifically this evening in collodion work.
Yeah, I think it's probably across a lot of different crafts, really. You see it with music, with vinyl. It's that idea of craftsmanship, I think, getting away from the digital. I shoot digital all day at work. So when I come to doing wet plate, I see it as different things, really. I see shooting wet plate as almost as theatre, as a performance. For me, some of it is quite meditative. Cutting and cleaning glass plates, I can do that after work, and I'd be well happy. Cutting and cleaning glass, I'm in my own little mindset, quite meditative. And then other times, it's broken down into stages of prepping the sitter, pouring the plates, then there's the rush to shoot the plate, and then the drama of is the plate going to melt when you varnish it and all that sort of thing. So it's very much a hands-on process. It's tactile, it's smelly, not so much noisy unless you're swearing a lot. But it's that tactile nature rather than digital, just press the button. I'll fix it in post later in Photoshop, that sort of thing. It's a frustrating process, but it's well worthwhile pursuing, definitely.
Right. Okay, I think we may have exhausted our questions actually. So if anyone has a last minute question for Tony, please drop them in. Otherwise, we will share Tony's website and information when we circulate the recording details in the next couple of days. So I'm sure Tony will pick up with that, and clearly he's keen to offer workshops as well, and I would certainly recommend that you avail yourself of that. I think then that probably brings us to the end, Tony. So firstly, on behalf of the Historical Group, thank you so much for your time this evening and for sharing some, well, firstly, some wonderful stories. The failures always seem to be more interesting than the successes, but it was fabulous. And yeah, I think it's certainly raised some interest and excitement, I think, amongst everyone. So I think you'll see some more people at the weekend in August. So we're circulate details of the collodion weekend in August after the event. So thank you again, Gilly, for arranging this evening. It's been really interesting, and look out for future talks in the series. So thank you again, Tony. Thanks, Gilly, and thank you to our audience for being with us this evening. Good night.